Buonasera a tutti. Welcome everybody. This is, I think, the sixth of our events of the series of Exile and Creativity. It's a very long series. We started on, I think, last February with an evening dedicated to Enrico Fermi, and we go on through many appointments, and three more we will have at the beginning of the next year. And we will have the last one at the end of February with a discussion between Carlo Ginzburg and Sound Freeland. This evening is dedicated to Paolo Milano and Renato Poggioli, two Italian intellectuals. In Italian, I would say letterati. I don't know if there is a word of this kind in English, but it means cultured people, scholar or journalists like Paolo Milano, but involved in many different things and fields, and able to connect different words, not only in culture, but also between two different countries like Italy and United States. Paolo Milano came to the United States in 1938 due to the racial laws and remained here until 1957. And Renato Poggioli, a fervent antifascist, left Italy as well in 1938, never to return, but maintaining strong bonds with his country of origins, so much that he founded an Italian magazine called Inventatio, very important magazine in the cultural debate in Italy in the late 50s and then 60s. Professor Franco Baldasso and Mattia Acetoso will speak respectively about Milano and Poggioli, but we have here also the son of Paolo Milano, Andrew Milano, and the daughter of Renato Poggioli, Sylvia Poggioli. And so before the speech of our two scholars, we will listen also to Andrew Milano and Sylvia Poggioli. Franco Baldasso is the director of Italian Studies, assistant professor of Italian at Bard College. Mattia Acetoso is assistant professor of Italian at Boston College, and he received his PhD from Yale University. Sylvia Poggioli is a very well-known voice, I think, for many of us, because he's the correspondent for NPR's international desk from Italy, and cover not only Italy, but in the past also Western Europe and the Balkans and the rest. So please enjoy, and I ask for starting our event, and Andrew Milano to come here and say some words about his father, Paolo Milano. Please.
No, well, just a couple of words about the image you're going to see here, because you have Paolo Milano on the left and Giorgio Bassani on the right, and we're going to show a couple of more photos from the Andrew Milano archive of his father.
So Paolo Milano was born in 1904 in an old Roman Jewish family that had been living in the ghetto in Rome for a good 500 years. His father was a successful businessman, and his father became president of the Jewish community in Rome. As a boy, Paolo loved to read, including, he claimed, reading the dictionary as a book, and page by page. His father was a rather demanding person, and all the obituaries for Paolo mention il banco sulla spiaggia, the desk on the beach. He was required to study at home, of course, at his desk. But when they went away for vacation, they took the desk with them. And he literally had to study on the beach. And his favorite day of the year was the day they left for the vacation and the desk was packed away. He had a classic education, I'm sure, like Poggioli in Greek and Latin in the Liceo. And then his father insisted that he go to law school. He was against it, but he went and spent most of his time really reading and his new interest, strong interest in drama. At the age of 22, after graduating from law school, he never spent a day as a lawyer. He took an interesting 4 years. Something like I would say like a 16th century secular humanist. He took a trip throughout the continent. And Paolo describes it in the curriculum vitae that he put together not long after he came here. He said he took a sojourn to the continent to make contacts with leading literary men and to broaden my knowledge of European literature and drama. He did that for 4 years, spending most of his time in France, Germany, and Austria. He returned to Rome then at the age of 26 and soon wrote a book about Lessing, a German intellectual, I think of the, maybe of the Enlightenment period, an older one? No. Yeah. In Rome in the 1930s, he became the editor of several literary and drama journals and became involved in anti-fascist causes. Little aside, Paolo claimed that he had his own fascist spy that followed him, and that on one occasion, this man, who they both knew who they were, they knew each other by sight, and this man asked him, wouldn't Paolo give him his itinerary so that he wouldn't have to spend so much time finding Paolo, but would know where he was going. I believe the story, but it was, I haven't looked in the archives. Sylvia Poggioli has looked in some of the archives to verify these facts, and I would be very interested in finding out her methods. Anyway, we do know that his apartment was ransacked at one point during this period. In the 1930s, he met and married my mother, Rachel Epstein, who was a Russian Jew who emigrated with her family to Palestine in the early 20s, went to Rome to study. At the time when Mussolini had opened up the Italian universities for free, and so many foreigners came and studied there. And they left after the racist laws were passed, and they went to Paris, where I was born, and then came to the United States. Paolo left behind, he tried to convince them, but he left behind his parents, his sister, and Paolo's nephew and niece, who remained in Rome during the war. Paolo's brother-in-law, Giorgio Fano, was killed in the Argentine Chaos Massacre after the Nazis took over Rome. When he arrived in New York after a brief stint dubbing films, which we have discussed, but I won't go into further, in Hollywood, he continued his anti-fascist agenda in New York. Along with Renato Poggioli, he was on the executive committee of the Mazzini Society, and his particular job was in charge of delivering radio and journal propaganda and writing it. And I gave Franco Baldasso a number of his scripts and writings. In addition, he was an active member of the anti-Stalinist partisan review group with McDonald and Mary McCarthy, and he later worked for the U.S. Office of War Information. beside his anti-fascist efforts, I think an important aim of Paolo's was to introduce Italian culture, literature, and drama to American intellectuals and the American public. It's striking that within 5 or 6 years of his arrival in New York, Paolo, who had no American contacts, had written nothing in English, accomplished the following. He became an assistant professor of comparative literature at Queens College. He taught a course in the history of drama at the New School, and in fact, Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando were both his students there, and he found them both mediocre. He was writing both political and literary articles in the Partisan Review, The Nation, and The Republic, and he had published a book in English on Henry James, and he had edited and wrote an introduction to the Viking Portable Dante, which became, I think, the standard college Dante test for many, many years. In addition, he was a regular contributor to the New York Times book review from the start. And in 1947, he wrote a cover page book review on the occasion of the publication in English of a translation of Carlo Levy's Christ Stopped at Eboli, which I'm sure many of you have read. In the review, I don't have a copy of the review, which I'm trying to find, but I do have a copy of quotations from the review. And in it he says, not only Christ stopped at Eboli, but all the gods, meaning all the gods around the world, have stopped short of millions of villages in China, India, and Africa, where people are dehumanized due to the centralization of power which controls the rest of the population through nationalist pride and fear. It sounds very relevant today as a description. And probably during this time, the very European humanist Paolo formed a tight relationship with two very American writers, both 10 years younger than Paolo, Saul Bellow and Alfred Kazin. During his early years, Saul Bellow lived a block away from us in Queens, and he and Paolo worked together on his books. Bellow dedicated an early book of his, The Victim, to Paolo, and he called Paolo his coach. And Kazin actually lived in our home for 3 months in the 40s when he was undergoing a divorce. And in fact, a number of writers lived with us. Let's say a number of intellectuals lived with us, including Lamberto Borghi, who lived with us for an entire year. What drew Saul and Alfred to Paolo was both his encyclopedic knowledge of European literature and his intimacy with European intellectuals. He introduced them to Italian and German intellectuals such as Chiaramonte, probably Poggioli, and Rudolf Arnheim. And I think they also liked about Paolo was his enormous energy and joie de vivre. He loved to tell a joke, and he could fill a room as soon as he came in. Both Bellow and Kazin remained close to Paolo for 40 years, including after he moved to Rome in 1956. By the 1980s, I'm not going to say much about his time in Italy, and Franco will fill us in, but by the 1980s, he had developed severe Parkinson's disease, which left him physically but not intellectually disabled. In a letter to Alan Bloom in 1981, Bellow describes visiting Paolo in Rome when he was living with a full-time caretaker. Bellow says, Paolo sleeps in a double bed, left-hand side. The right side is loaded with new books. The wife's side of the bed. When Paolo died, I called Saul Bellow. I wasn't expecting this. I called Saul Bellow to tell him about his death. And during the phone call, I complained to him. I reminded Saul Bellow that if he had had a party at his house, and the Italian 12-tone composer Luigi Dalla Piccola had discovered that I was Paolo's son. And he asked me a few questions and then loudly said, Paolo Milano's son doesn't speak Latin? And I said, you know, it wasn't always easy to be Paolo Milano's son. And he said, I'll tell you a story. He said, I was in your grandfather's house with Paolo. And Paolo went out of the room to do something. And your grandfather said to me, how come Paolo is so smart? And you get all the awards. And he doesn't. And I think he was saying something about Bello also wasn't very well recognized by his family, and particularly his father. But, and perhaps Paolo did not live up to his father's expectations. But I think, and also Paolo had disappointed himself in one sense because he had not become the novelist that he really wanted to be. That was one goal that he had not achieved with all the other things that he did. But I think you'll agree with what Franco Modigliani said to me when he said that Paolo had lived a truly admirable life. And I certainly agree.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this important words about the Paolo Milano. I try to follow up. It's very difficult because, of course, I'm trying to look at Milano from my point of view, which is the one of a scholar of Exile, of a scholar of Milano's creativity, and try to, try out an assessment of his work, not just from the point of view of American culture, but from Italian culture. Paolo Milano was a great bridge between the two cultures. Especially, I'm going to talk about his book, Note in margine a una vita assente, Marginal Notes about an absent life. Più vicino, closer. Okay, I got very close there. And with these words, I'm trying to see the heritage of Milano from a special perspective, looking at what he said more about what he lived. But, and I'm going to start from a quote. That was a name to reckon with. When I first heard it uttered by the Jean Figue through the French and Italian Hall of Brooklyn College, he was a Jewish Italian exile from Mussolini, publishing in Partisan Review a reputedly devastating ladies' man. He taught at Queens College and occasionally gave lectures at Brooklyn when the girls who had given up their Jewishness for Bruce, well, they kept their version of Jewishness, but didn't call attention to it and accepted Milano's boom. So begins an amused commemoration of Paolo Milano, known in Italy mostly as the refined and sophisticated literary critic of L'Espresso, basically the Italian New Yorker, between 1957 and 1996, just 2 years before his death. Besides recollections taken from out of Brownsville, encounters with Nobel laureates and other Jewish writers. Its author is Jules Chamatsky, an influential Jewish literary critic who opened the way to cultural studies. Chamatsky dedicated many affectionate pages to Milano, who, after the anti-Semitic laws, left Italy as an exile in Paris, and then at the beginning of 1940 in New York. A city Milano will definitely leave only in 1956. Chamatsky tells the amusing story of the encounter with the Italian literary critic in Rome, and apparently from what we heard from Andrew, many people were going to Rome to visit him in his house, full of books. Many decades later. Despite his old age, Milano is still legendarily charming, and as his former colleagues at the Queens and Brooklyn College reported. Chamatsky recounts a visit to Italy when he in his life had a conversation with Milano in his house in Rome, in which the huge amount of books take the space of real people. We listen to him in fascination, Chamatsky concludes. And here, I have a very interesting picture of Milano and one of the most prominent writers of the 50s and 60s, namely the author of The Garden of Uffizi Contini, Bassani, Giorgio Bassani, but also I have other photos. This is also with his, an older Milano with one of his best friends, so Bello, and I love to see this photo because it's with Nathalie Serrault, one of the greatest French writers of the 20th century. But I have something else also to say, besides the celebration of his biography. Memory is a marvelous tool, wrote Primo Levi, but it is fallible. It is open to error. The fascination around European intellectual in exile from fascism is just one side of the coin. This fascination hides complex, layered, multifaceted, and often sorrowful stories. It hides crucial aspects, including the point of view of the protagonists, the exiles, who, from afar, were able to elaborate a compelling reading of their own culture and society, but also of that of the country which was hosting them. In most cases, assimilation was never fully achieved, for reasons that are often extremely personal and not always political. This is what historian Enzo Traverso called the epistemological vantage point of exile. Namely, distance allows exiles a new perspective that involves the exceptional psychological and existential experience they gain, and can become a hermeneutic vantage point, a new vantage point for the interpretation of their life and their own culture. In his exile in America, after racial laws, Milano fully experienced the condition of a stateless person. And a polide letterario, literary stateless person, will be the definition of Eugenio Montale, the great poet Eugenio Montale, will give to Milano. Yet the inclusion of this figure in the book of a public intellectual like Chamatsky, a book recollecting the encounters of an entire life, in which Milano figures together with more celebrated authors such as Allen Ginsberg, Saul Bellow, Joseph Brodsky, Amos Oz, and Erica John, tells another story, which is important for today's conversation. Chamatsky bears witness to the pivotal and active role Milano played in New York's intellectual community of the early post-war. Chamatsky's audience is constituted essentially by American Jews who mirrored themselves, or at least ideally recognized themselves, in this intellectual community. In fact, the Partisan Review, the Queens and Brooklyn College even proofs are all explicit references for each of Chamatsky's readers. What is more, they are all salient moments of Milano's intellectual biography, and we should start from them to understand this figure. This is the aspect of Milano's exile that I would like to highlight today. Not just his exilic dramatic experience, but also his active contribution to the understanding of society and culture that hosted him. We remember his championing American literature in Italy, especially in his work for Espresso, in the pioneering book on Henry James, published in 1948. We shouldn't forget, however, how his pioneering activity worked also in the opposite direction, with the essay on Pavese and Silone for the New Republic. As a matter of fact, the privileged point of view of the exile, as we call it, emerges from Milano's writing, less directly involved with his work as a literary critic, as a reviewer, as a professional reader, as he called himself. Of the many pages that were not published during his life, attempted novels, lectures on American literature, and a diary of about 4,000 pages, I will analyze today one of the two books he had completed, although they were published posthumously. As I said before, Note in margine a una vita assai. A selection from the pages of his own diary on which he worked for years. One of the main motifs of Milano's Note is what he calls the technological shock that accompanied his experience of the American metropolis, and that he sensed as a fundamental to American ethics and mentality. Milano insightfully understands how this shock will constitute the basis for a new vision of the world that substitute old ones, and not only in Italy, but in entire Europe. Moreover, Milano not only highlights the increasing alienation that is a big part of the homologation of mass society, but also the bad faith of an apocalyptic interpretation of this momentous change, a typical European and Eurocentric bad faith. As he writes in his private papers, and quote, "Huge is now the number of Europeans and Americans that if they could, but they can't, would live in both of the two shores of the Atlantic, sometime here and sometime there. Negative aspect of this phenomenon. Spiritually, our world is constituted by displaced persons, rootless, déracinés in the sense given by Simone Weil, which is a more profound continuation of the Marxist conception of alienation." End of quote. This aspiration, however, also has a positive aspect, and Milano continues. The need to overthrow, to demolish, to breathe different air elsewhere, to infinitely multiply relationships, against which all the institutionalized authorities of the universe conspire with facts, not only with words. As Martino Marazzi has shown, differently from other 20th century Italian exiles in the US, such as Giuseppe Pezzolini, quote, Milano's America, both in its pettiness and its greatness, has become a constituted part of the life of the onlooker. Thus, he can judge, but without claiming to be in a foreign body. Indeed, Milano collaborated with the most prestigious journals of the New York left, and he was also a promoter of the Europe-America groups, together with intellectuals such as Dwight McDonald, Mary McCartney, Nicola Cremonte, Nicola Tucci, as Andrew said before, until the group split on the issue of whether or not accepting Stalinism. In this reflection on American literature and society, he was obliged to admit the impossibility of separating the interpretation of the past with present political struggles. An extremely learned and sophisticated literary and theater critic, for Milano, cosmopolitism was not a personal choice, but a necessity, almost an obligation, like it was for many other European Jews in exile. And we can mention here the bitter sarcasm you can find in the famous pages of Hannah Arendt in the article We Refugees. Still, his reflection on distance and on his condition as a stateless person will make of this obligation the standpoint for further critical and moral inquiry, honing his skepticism to critical theories that were then occupying the public debate, such as psychoanalysis and Marxism, and the formalism of the so-called new criticism. As mentioned earlier, in his book Not Immagine, Milano is especially critical to the dogmatic core he can see in these doctrines, what he calls doctrines, that according to him compete in the huge undertaking of diverting human beings from the world of evidence and of intimate persuasion. And he continues, thus, the greatest ideologies of our century, Marxism and psychoanalysis, are two doctrines of historical import, which bestow truthful insights that cannot be suppressed, but they are nevertheless substantially false and dangerous as system of thought. Despite his love for Proust, for example, his own exilic experience compels him to take the part of 19th century French literary critic Sainte-Beuve, the critical target of the author of La Recherche, du Temps perdu. Proust, who wrote a book against Sainte-Beuve, in fact criticized the literary critic because he put the analysis of ambient, author, biography, and social circumstances before the interpretation of a work of art, undermining, following Proust here, its autonomy. Doubtless, Milano is too skeptical and cosmopolitan to feel any nostalgia for Sainte-Beuve and his 19th century positivism. But at the same time, he cannot accept the denial of social, political, even private experience as an ideological principle with which to build an assessment of present times. The more bitter pages on his own condition of exile point out how a most important consequence of the neurotic state, in a split that the exiled person experiences, is the impossibility of a full participation in the new life imposed by exile. A further consequence is a withdrawal, a sort of retreat towards all that is private, intimate, and personal. And he says, I am now the perfect exile. I cannot express but private feelings, draw with my imagination characters that are hanging in the air, concentrate on abstract ideas. Very soon, I myself will become totally abstract. My identity will be only in my idea. I will be just a document. For Milano, the knowledge gathered from experience is not a static result, but an ongoing process, the true objective of his inquiry. Milano will come back to this idea at the very end of his intellectual career in an article for L'Espresso, in which he hopes for a literature that in the future would not give up its cognitive and fact-finding task. Literature, he writes, should describe us what really happens in our society. How so? Someone could reply. In the century of mass media, how can there be lack of information? That's exactly how it is. Our media drown us in a stream of news without portraying anything authentic, nor offering the tools that can help us for a more profound and nuanced understanding. End of. This is probably the most remarkable aspect of Milano's intellectual activity. From his interpretation of contemporary literature, the criticism of American society's institutions. The comfortable solutions that are available in the conspicuous consumption of modern society are totally at odds with the idea of freedom that he elaborates throughout his own experience of exile. Skeptical of Marxism and psychoanalysis as a system of thought, Milano is at the same time a sharp critic of the profit mindset that he feels is becoming the ideological principle of the new cultural industry. The American way of life, he writes, is a multiplication of what has been already lived by others, a progressive immunization of the future, a glittering paralysis. In his writing, the suspicion that the American way of life will become a religious, if not a theological discourse, takes center stage. According to Milano, the dogmatism of the American way of life leads to a new ethics that legitimizes economical success overall. This is the principal theme of the many conversations with his friend Sobello, and of countless reflections of the 1950s, which somehow anticipate the counterculture of the following decade. In his diary, Milano notes down an exchange he had with Alberto Moravia, concluding that the life of every American is a private struggle with the American way of life. In the following years, Milano will develop this idea of freedom based on the experience of his exile. In his writing, he will describe such experience as a stark objection to contemporary ideological narratives. Today, he writes, the inefficiency of ideologies are crystal clear. Aesthetics prescribed by politics are useful only to hide the object of our attention, namely the work of art we are looking at, and to promote, even in critical theory, that escape from reality, it is one of the most distressing signs of our era. When permanently back in Italy, after 1956, Milano launches an idea of literary criticism resisting ideologies that avoid the confrontation with experience. His critique of the escape from reality, as we just mentioned, that he senses as characterizing problem of modernity, is not only an ethical, aesthetical principle, but it is based on lived experience, especially that of exile. And as in his note in margine, writing is then an attempt, always fallible, at times even desperate, to contrast such escape, a sort of dismission of reality and of the tradition that experience testifies despite every possible ideological obsession. Since the very first line of the book, Milano makes clear that this is not the diary of a soul, but a testimony. He suggests to read it as a chronicle of a state of bewilderment, of a sort of abjection. Such conditions not his, but that of a certain world to which the author was bound. With this book, Milano claims that he wanted to circumscribe a certain moral illness of our times, and since it did not destroy me, such illness had something to teach me. If moral illness is a common trope of the post-war cultural landscape, why does Milano qualify his reflection as testimony? The answer is to be found at the end of the book, when the author returns to the main motifs of his writing. One of the most dramatic passages of Milano's diary is when he reflects on the necessity of giving up his own writing, which he considers not just a critical discourse, but also the truest expression of the self. Aware of his limits as a writer, yet demanding on the verge of neurosis, Milano recognizes his failure as a writer in the moment when he completes his most important work, the Note Immagine, which corresponds to the acknowledgement of his personal voyeurism. The author finally admits, in America, I learned to be skeptical of my own imagination. I was ashamed, much more than in Europe, of my own lies. Here, the reverence for facts themselves was born in me, just like my nausea for all abstract systems. Once again, what is more essential is what can be found elsewhere. Milano concludes, these notebooks is my personal way to survive. Of course, I'm not talking here of any literary fame, but of my everyday struggle with the absolute dispersion, with nothingness. I cannot resign myself to become dust. His testimony is also the recognition of his own generational failure, despite the generous attempt to engage with contemporary politics from an intellectual perspective. One has only to think of his engagement with the Europe-America groups, and also of articles such as a free theater for a free people, Challenge to America, published in 1942 for Theater Arts. Yet the real key to understanding his testimony is perhaps again in his own exile, in his privileged viewpoint that enables him to move from a personal sense of loss to a more broader intellectual and historical issue. One of the great infamy of our times, writes Milano a few pages later, is that thousands of intellectuals of our times have become ruthless. They are now neither fish nor flesh, so they suffer twice and for two reasons. Milano's diary bears witness to a generation struggling with a state of dispersion against the widespread abstraction due to the stateless condition that he so well described. Milano's moral illness of that time, a motif that is omnipresent in early post-war literature, acquires in these pages a different meaning. It seems now easier to understand Milano's annoyance with Marxism and psychoanalysis. For him, alienation is not just the consequence of a capitalist superstructures or psychological determinism, but a historical consequence of exile. What is more, Milano does not isolate this historical experience to his own personal catharsis, but elaborates it as an outpost to better understand the epochal change under his very eyes. The consequences of exile clarify its constitutional alternative to the host culture, and at the same time the impossibility of a full return to the source, to his own native culture. In his book, just continental flights have, in this regard, a special place. When crossing the ocean in a few hours, Milano perceives how incongruous is this flight with his own experience, testifying the distance between human imagination and the machines that mankind is able to produce. Mankind is disoriented by its own creations, by its own machines, as in the case of the atomic bomb. There are two fundamental consequences of this harrowing bewilderment, which in Milano's writing surpasses individual experience as it characterizes an entire age in its intellectual output. The first is the phenomenon that Milano calls perdere la lingua, losing one's own mother tongue, which he sees linked to what he feels as a feroce nostalgia, a savage nostalgia for his own tongue. According to the author, this phenomenon is common to literati distant in time and space, such as Stendhal, but is especially strong and intellectually challenging in contemporary figures like Vladimir Nabokov, that Milano met in person here in New York. The second consequence is the radical critique to what he deems the real problem of the American way of life, its suffocating lack of authenticity. Milano's reflections analyze the many contradictions of the affluent American society, from the obsession to normalcy, to what he sees as the widespread racial anxiety, to the dangerous fundamental bond of the Puritan spirit between business and theology. Milano sees the American tragedy in the denial of tragedy in American everyday life. In his diary, all the many conversations with Saul Bellow revolve around what he deems the true mirage of the increasing social homogenization. Security and normalcy become the big fetishes of the American way of life. And with this acknowledgement, my contribution on Milano today ends. His testimony of widespread moral illness bear witness to displacement is not only existential, but historical, possibly the common intellectual denominator of Milano's age. Thank you very much.
Is this working? All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm very honored to be here this evening and at the Italian Cultural Institute, because it was at the Italian Cultural Institute in Prague that my father had his very first job. He was its executive secretary in 1934 and 1935. 2 years ago, I started going through my father's papers, and I learned many details of his life in the 1930s while he was studying and teaching in several cities of what was then Mitteleuropa. For me, the most emotional reading was reading my parents' intense correspondence during their courtship, mostly while my father was in Prague and my mother was studying in Madrid. And reading my father's youthful letters, I'm amazed by how much he knew when access to information was much more limited than today, especially due to ideology. During fascism, American literature was all but banned by the regime, and hardly any contemporary literature was translated into Italian. But once outside Italy, my father made up for lost time. In a 1935 letter, he mentioned some American books he had read: Edgar E. Masters' Boom River Anthology, Sinclair Lewis's Main Street and Ann Vickers, and Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones. In another letter, he mentions Dos Passos. In trying to find out more about my parents and their political odyssey from Europe to the United States, I obtained copies of fascist secret police files from Italy's National Archives. Although they were living in what were then two democratic countries, Czechoslovakia and Spain, my parents were very cautious in their letters and never openly expressed their political opinions. Nevertheless, I'm sure they had no idea just how closely they were under fascist secret police surveillance. For my father, it began at the age of 24 when he was in Prague for postgraduate studies. In February 1932, the Florence Police Office received a report from an Italian agent in Prague who wrote, quote, "Poggioli maintains a reserved manner, and I have nothing to remark about his political activities. But," he added, "indirectly I have learned that he does not have fascist sympathies, not due to any particularly malevolent reason or out of resentment, but simply because this young man, although gifted with a remarkable education and culture, is the typical example of that liberal mentality that emerges in every circumstance despite his efforts to hide it." My parents' correspondence stopped after they married in November 1935, and they moved to Vilna, where my father taught Italian literature. 2 years later, they moved to Warsaw. Their Polish years, 1935-1938, were marked by the deteriorating situation in Europe, and it's thanks to the fascist files that I've been able to piece together something about their lives. A file in my father's dossier dated April 6, 1936, typed on plain paper, with no indication of the identity of the author or to whom it was addressed, illustrates the fascist racist thought process. And it quotes, "In Vilna, not long ago, a Pole beat up Poggioli because he took him for a Jew. This might suggest that by spending too much time with Jews and in non-national circles, meaning not Italian, Poggioli gives the impression of being a philo-Semite or a Jewish internationalist." My parents often spoke to me about the ugly incident that forced them to leave Italy and Europe. Several passages in the last letters they exchanged before they married, as well as the fascist files, added details to that incident. Writing from Poland ahead of their wedding, my father sent my mother a list of people who should receive their wedding announcement. It included the name of Eva Kuhn Amendola, whom my father described as an Italian-Polish widow, a woman of great dignity and worthy of compassion. "I will tell you who she is when we see each other." Recognizing the last name, my mother asked in reply, "Is that woman perhaps the wife of that man from Montecatini? Poor thing, what a painful story." That woman was the Polish-born widow of one of Mussolini's fiercest opponents, the politician Giovanni Amendola, who died after being beaten up by Mussolini's thugs in 1926 in the Tuscan town of Montecatini. His murder was a key event in the consolidation of the fascist one-party state. My parents had told me that they had felt free to speak openly with the widow of the fascist martyr about their opposition to Mussolini. But they did not know that Amendola's widow had become closely linked to the futurist and pro-fascist poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and that she had donated her wedding ring to the regime after Mussolini asked Italian women to sacrifice their gold rings for the glory of the nation. She also wanted my father's position as lecturer in Italian studies. Academic rivalry intersected with the poisonous dominant politics of the time, and she reported him to Italian authorities as an opponent of the regime. The story my parents had told me was confirmed in the smallest details in an anonymous report from the fascist secret police. Eva Mendola, this is the quote, Eva Mendola has written to the Foreign Ministry numerous times to report that Professor Poggioli carries out anti-fascist propaganda and has ties to Russian Bolsheviks. The informer added, up to now, her reports were not given much consideration because she said repeatedly that she wants to replace Poggioli in his teaching post. However, the spy pointed out, her accusations against Poggioli are very detailed, including the charge that he does not distribute the propaganda material on the Italian-Ethiopian war that was made available to him, and that he maintains constant ties with Jewish members of a Jewish study group center in Vilnius with clearly racist and anti-fascist leanings. The spy added, Poggioli's wife also carries out propaganda against us. While Eva Mendola affirms that after her husband's death, she withdrew from political activity and, on the contrary, has always carried out excellent and sincere propaganda abroad on our behalf. Sometime later, my parents were warned that Eva Mendola had denounced them to fascist authorities as enemies of the people, and they told me they were tipped off by the Warsaw correspondent of the regime-run Italian news agency, Stefani, whose journalists were often required also to be informers. In this case, the reporter was creative with the truth, and when questioned by fascist authorities, he vouched for my father's political credentials. But the Polish incident was a close call, and the message was clear. The next time, they might not be so lucky. My parents began making plans to get out of Europe. One possible destination was Argentina, where no visa was required. Then my father learned there was a one-year opening to teach Italian literature at Smith College. He applied, and he got the job. As soon as he arrived in Northampton in September 1938, my father began looking for other teaching jobs in order to remain in the US. And a year later, he was teaching at Brown. 3 weeks after the Third Reich invaded Poland, Renato Poggioli joined forces with several other Italian anti-fascist emigres in the US and helped draft the founding charter of the Mazzini Society, which soon became the largest anti-fascist organization outside Italy. And once again, my father became the object of attention of Mussolini's goons. In a dispatch from the Italian embassy in Washington to the Foreign Ministry in Rome dated August 21st, 1941, an informer disdainfully underscored the Jewish nature of the Mazzini Society. Other dispatches lamented the media coverage given the Mazzini Society by Anglo-Jewish dailies such as PM and the New York Post, as well as financial support from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. After the US entered the war, the government classified my father as a citizen of an enemy state. He was given a choice, either go into an internment camp for enemy aliens or be drafted. He had already done his military service in Italy, but the choice was obvious. My mother took over his teaching duties at Brown, and my father left for basic training at Camp Barkley in Texas near Abilene. He described his military life in detail in the wartime diary I found among his papers. It contains scathing commentary, not just on the Allies' plans for post-war Europe, but also the widespread racism and prejudice he observed in American society. My father's political passion caused him problems also here in the US. His vision of the post-war future, outlined in many documents co-signed with the other founders of the Mazzini Society, was of a Republican Italy closely tied to an independent federal Europe. After the landing in Sicily in the summer of 1943, the Italian exiles called for the creation of a provisional government embracing both exiles and opposition leaders inside the country. According to the proposal, such a government should deal with the United States on an equal footing, a position not shared by the US government. While serving in the Army, my father applied for US citizenship and was turned down without explanation. After pressing his captain, he was told an FBI inquiry had found his membership in the Mazzini Society very suspect. The captain told Private Poggioli, "You are far from being considered a political enemy. Nevertheless, you cannot be considered, especially in foreign policy, a political friend." After I filed a Freedom of Information request with the FBI, I received heavily redacted documents with entire paragraphs blacked out. But it was clear the investigation had been triggered by someone my father knew in the Army who had informed of his suspect ideas, a recurring theme in his career on both sides of the Atlantic. My father was finally granted citizenship in 1950, but he remained a person of interest throughout the McCarthy witch hunt period. One of the FBI files revealed the existence of a mysterious US Army intelligence operation called the Kent Project, whose purpose was to root out US citizens living in Italy suspected of communist sympathies. This was 1953, when my father was on sabbatical leave teaching at Rome University and also lecturing throughout Italy on behalf of the US Information Service based at the US Embassy in Rome. Had the Kent Project agents bothered to inform themselves, they would have learned that a few years earlier, my father had provoked the wrath of the Italian Communist Party, which after the fall of fascism had been embraced by many Italian intellectuals. Why were the Italian communists so angry with him? Perhaps because of the introduction to his 1949 book of translations and literary criticism of modern Russian poets, Il fiore del verso russo, literally the flower of Russian poetry. The Soviet Revolution, he wrote, among other things, marked, with the decadence of art, the twilight of poetry and of literature, which was made subservient by mediocre writers to the need to agitate, to make propaganda of the party, the regime, the state. My father's book angered the party because it included poets Stalin had persecuted as post-revolutionary enemies of the state, some of whom had died in the gulags. Nevertheless, despite the Italian Communist Party's fierce denunciation, the book it dubbed The Poison Flower was reprinted in Italy 4 times over 5 decades. By this time, my father was teaching at Harvard, both in the Russian and comparative literature departments. But he maintained his cultural ties to Italy by founding, together with his friend Luigi Berti, the literary journal Inventatio, whose aim, he said, was to deprovincialize Italians by introducing them to the best of European and American literature. He was convinced that the cosmopolitan world of letters could help regenerate the tainted world of Italian politics. Its international board of directors included at different times a who's who of literary stars: Vladimir Nabokov, Robert Lowell, T.S. Eliot, Alan Tate, and Robert Penn Warren. It ran contributions from writers such as Thomas Mann, Paul Éluard, Saint-Jean-Perse, W.H. Auden, and many, many more. My most vivid memories of this period were my parents' lively dinner parties, smoke-filled evenings with the tinkle of scotch on the rocks and a cacophony of foreign accents, ladies with long cigarette holders, and intense discussions about Pasternak, Fidel Castro, and the failed Hungarian uprising. My parents' world was polyglot, filled with European expatriates who, like them, had found refuge in the US from persecution and repression in their homelands, citizens of the world who shared a passion for democracy and freedom and a love of political debate. And this is how the Harvard Gazette described Renato Poggioli. To see him leaving the library, juggling books and gestures with both hands, his Etruscan face illuminated by a wide smile and a dangling cigarette, answering a band of questioners in half a dozen languages, was to feel that, for a moment at least, the steps of Widener Library had become the terrace of a Latin Quarter cafe. That was written after he died in a car crash in California in 1963. He was 56. I was 16.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here for the first time at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you to Director Giorgio Van Straten for inviting me, and to Sylvia Poggioli for thinking of me in the first place for this event. I'm really honored in particular to be able to discuss the work and life of Renato Poggioli, a scholar who has been an inspiration and a point of reference in my career for so many years now. I first encountered Renato Poggioli in college through the pages of Il fiore del verso russo, his most popular anthology of Russian poetry, as we've seen, also pretty contested. This edition of the book, the first edition of the book that I was reading, published in 1949, was introduced also by a small note that said, and I'm translating, we believe this book will be a revelation for the Italian readership. It was just a young student, and this book was indeed a revelation for me. Seldom had I seen before so much care and vividness in portraying one of the most fertile seasons of Russian poetry. But the real revelation came when I learned more about its author, the scholar whose biography and career were defined by the experience of exile. So I will discuss this very experience and its impact on Poggioli's work. I would like, however, to offer an unusual angle of analysis. Exile was possibly a blessing in disguise and a redeeming experience for Renato Poggioli when he left Italy for the United States due to his opposition to the fascist regime. During his American years, Poggioli pursued a successful academic career, teaching in the most prestigious North American universities and publishing seminal works in the field of comparative literature, as well as in Italian and Slavic studies. It is during his American years that Poggioli's critical horizon fully developed into an all-encompassing perspective on the world of letters. In exile, Poggioli gained new eyes on the world he left behind. The very experience of exile was instrumental in defining the intellectual contours of Poggioli's scholarly work. First of all, because in exile, Poggioli found intellectual and personal freedom he could never have enjoyed in fascist Italy. Second of all, being forced to relocate to international academic settings provided Poggioli with a truly comparative perspective on literary matters, as well as the professional opportunity to fully bloom as a scholar. In this presentation, I would like to focus on the biographical details of Poggioli's move to the United States and examine his relationship with Italy and Italian culture in his early American years. More specifically, I would like to focus on a crucial moment of his exile, his return, or lack thereof. While he never ceased his attempts to influence the literary debates in Italy, Poggioli chose to never return to his own country. Despite his efforts to actively participate in intellectual development of post-war Italy, and despite publishing groundbreaking books, articles, and translations for way too many years, Poggioli was relegated to intellectual oblivion and jettisoned by the intellectual debates on fields of study that he had helped to shape in the first place, such as the theory of the avant-garde and the study of comparative literature. While in recent years more studies have appeared, Poggioli's intellectual legacy still fails to be acknowledged fully, especially in Italy, where his fame barely amounts to faint recognition for his work as a pioneer of Slavic literature. I argue that Poggioli's true exile, though, was not his American experience, but the damnatio memoriae that has affected a proper reception of his intellectual legacy up to this day. Renato Poggioli was born in Florence in 1907, the city where his intellectual apprenticeship took place. In 1929, he graduated in Slavic literature from the University of Florence with a thesis on the Russian symbolist poet Alexander Blok. During the 1920s, Poggioli attended the literary circles of the Florentine cafe Le Giupperos, where many protagonists of the Florentine Italian interwar culture used to gather: Eugenio Montale, Elio Vittorini, Mario Prats, Tommaso Landolfi, and many others. Poggioli was among them a master and an attentive forecaster of new literary trends from all over Europe. According to the testimonies of his peers, he was a restless soul, always discovering new authors and works, and equally eager to share his discoveries with colleagues and friends. Poggioli's fascination with Europe's literary tradition, mixed with his impatience toward the provincialism of fascist Italy, prompted him to seek employment abroad early on in his academic career. In the 1930s, he received both teaching and research appointments in several academic institutions throughout Eastern Europe. In 1931, he became an exchange scholar in Prague, where he returned the following academic year as secretary of the Italian Institute of Culture. In 1935, Poggioli moved to Vilnius as an instructor of Italian. 2 years later, he was transferred to Warsaw as a lecturer of Italian. A prolific essayist and translator, Poggioli published abundantly on different subjects concerning Slavic literature, eventually receiving tenure in Slavic philology at the University of Florence in 1938. However, upon returning to Italy that same year, Poggioli never fulfilled his teaching obligations, as he frankly began looking for a way out of the country. In 1938, Poggioli and his wife prepared to leave Europe. Luisa Nordio, Poggioli's sister-in-law, helped them move to the United States. Nordio was then a teacher at Vassar College and, more importantly, a militant of the movement Giustizia e Libertà, who followed in the footsteps of her teacher and mentor, the historian Gaetano Salvemini, first to France and then to the United States. Nordio recommended Poggioli for a one-year appointment as a teacher of Dante Smith College in Northampton. Shortly afterward, Poggioli received an invitation to join the Smith faculty directly from President William Allen Wilson, who had already offered shelter to many other European intellectuals that were fleeing totalitarian regimes in their own countries. After Smith, Poggioli accepted the position of assistant professor of Italian literature, language and literature at Brown University before settling at Harvard in 1947, first as professor of Slavic literatures, then as a founding member of the Department of Comparative Literatures. Poggioli was undoubtedly one of Mussolini's gifts to American universities, as Renato Poggioli wittily defined the free-spirited intellectuals who left Italy for the more hospitable shores of the United States. But what are the actual reasons for Poggioli's exile? As Carlo remembers in Moving Eulogy, Poggioli was a free spirit and a preternaturally anti-fascist intellectual. Both stated that the intellectual climate in Italy's 1930s was not suitable for the free-spirited intellectual nature, and even later commentators seem to be content with this interpretation. Del Terza described Poggioli's anti-fascism as Jacobean and picturesque. However, Poggioli's anti-fascism came to full fruition when he finally moved to New England and felt free to express his true political views. After his move, Poggioli followed in the footsteps of other notable Italian exiles, such as the previously mentioned Salvini, Giuseppe Borghese, Max Ascoli, and others. As Sylvia already mentioned, Poggioli was among the founders of the Providence chapter of the Mazzini Society, a group of Italian anti-fascist emigres who distanced themselves from the Communist Party and expressed political views inspired by the liberal teaching of Piero Gobetti. During his early American years, Poggioli strengthened his friendship with Salvini, with whom he often discussed the future of post-fascist Italy and the possible role of exiled intellectuals in it. In the early years of his exile, Poggioli's view was still inevitably Eurocentric. His main concern was to determine Italy's cultural role within the continent. With Salvini co-signed essays where they theorized and discussed Italy's future as a republic and as part of a federal European Union. However, in a few years, Poggioli developed a completely different intellectual perspective. He began to think of Europe as a smaller player in a much broader juxtaposition between East and West. In his words, his point of view had become Atlantic. During his American stay, Poggioli gained new eyes and his perspective became more open to the rest of the world. He articulated his new vision in the first issue of the journal Inventatio, and spelled out his desire for a world of culture that would overcome national boundaries and envision an ideal encounter between East and West in the realm of letters. In this essay, Poggioli acknowledged for the first time that Europe looked very small from his new point of view. The shift in perspective possibly inspired Poggioli to reject the idea of a return to Italy after the end of World War II. All exiled intellectuals, when the conditions that determined their exiles ceased to exist, faced a crossroads. Many others decided to return. Salvini and Borghese, for example, went back to Italy, where they reprised their original roles in the Society of Letters. Others made their exile permanent, like Max Ascoli, who became an American citizen in 1939. Poggioli was no less an exile with his intellectuals. He had been uprooted from his family and friends and never ceased to worry about the destiny of his own country during the war. Together with Salvini, he paid visits and offered assistance to Italian POWs held captive in internment camps in Staten Island, discussing their education and their possible employment in post-fascist Italy. Also, during his compulsory military service in the US Army, he officially asked to be deployed on the Italian front, although his request was eventually denied. Finally, Poggioli suffered from the lack of contact with his friends and family and always felt his cultural identity was Italian. Considering these facts, one may think Poggioli's true wish was to come back to Italy as soon as the fascist regime collapsed. However, official and personal letters prove otherwise. He first applied for American citizenship in 1943, only 5 years after his arrival in the United States. This fact alone would cast doubts over Poggioli's resolve to return to his homeland. As he confirmed to family and friends on several occasions, in the United States he gained freedom, both political and intellectual, which he had never enjoyed before in his life. Poggioli is explicit in one of his letters to Eugenio Montale, where he explains one of the reasons behind his choice not to return to Italy. In 1847 he wrote, and I quote, "I fully enjoy my condition as a foreigner, or rather as an Atlantic, one of those people suspended in limbo between two continents, or two epochs, or simply two groups, who knows?" End of quote. It is clear that at this point in his life, Poggioli perceived his American experience as a new opportunity rather than a forced exile. Later in his career, Poggioli visited Italy on several occasions and even returned a few times as a visiting scholar at the universities of Rome and Florence. But Poggioli never again entertained the idea of permanently returning to Italy. However, he focused on how he could influence Italian culture with his own work. As already mentioned, in 1946, he founded Inventatio, a literary journal that he co-edited with his friend, the poet Luigi Berti, also a prolific translator of English and a companion of his intellectual gatherings at the Giubberosi. Inventario was a unique intellectual experiment for the time. It aimed at disrupting the provincialism that had affected Italian culture during the fascist era and in its aftermath. Poggioli's and Berti's project sought to create a sort of a republic of letters, an intellectual utopia for a world that was just recovering from the chaos of World War II. With this ambition in mind, Poggioli sought to bring together scholars from different national traditions and political views. Poggioli placed his editorial activity at the same level as writing or teaching, and all these activities served a superior moral objective: to create an intellectual connection between the two shores of the Atlantic. It is important also to realize that Inventario represented another incarnation of Poggioli's idea of militant criticism, a scholarship that exists also outside of the academic world and seeks to reach a broader audience. For many years, Inventario was Poggioli's main focus of interest, and many of his monographs were first published in its pages. The Anglo-American intellectual community welcomed Inventario with great enthusiasm. Poggioli's project received private and public praise from such intellectuals as Isaiah Burney, T.S. Eliot, James McLaughlin, and other influential protagonists of the Anglo-American world of letters. Unfortunately, the Italian public failed to recognize its full intellectual scope and mostly remembers Poggioli almost exclusively as a pioneer of Russian studies and as a translator of Russian. In mentioning this, I do not to undermine Poggioli's work as a translator, quite the opposite. Throughout the years, Poggioli published a significant number of influential translations from Russian, most notably the anthology Creatività verso Russo, still in print today. But we need to understand that Poggioli's activity as a translator was not divorced from his work as a critic. In a seminal article entitled The Adept Artificer, Poggioli explained the translator's role in bridging two cultures and the creative impulse that presided over his own translations. Poggioli compared the translator to a music conductor who confronts the work of another author and seeks to decipher and present it to an audience. This idea extends far beyond his activity as a translator and applies to his work as a critic as well, a critic called upon to bridge different cultures. In the early American years, Poggioli published in equal measure in Italy, in the United States, supervising monographs of great scope and influence. These include The Phoenician Spider, an outstanding work on the representation of the human psyche in Russian classics, in particular by philosopher Vasily Rozanov and novelist Leo Tolstoy. Eventually, Poggioli's focus of research evolved, reflecting a more active role in the field of Italian studies. Poggioli published influential essays on Dante, paired with more extensive works on the history of Italian literature, published in English with a didactic intent. After his move to Harvard, Poggioli returned to Slavic studies, but his critical perspective had changed, embracing with greater awareness an interdisciplinary and translational approach, contributing to the rebirth and consolidation of comparative literature as an independent field of study. The most popular book, and most representative of this period, is The Theory of the Avant-Garde, a monograph that had a profound impact on American academia. Here, Poggioli discusses the idea of the avant-garde as a direct evolution of Romanticism, not only as an artistic current, but as a natural phenomenon capable of revealing a common psychological condition in modern culture. His analysis spans from futurism to fashion, from technology to contemporary alienation, offering a sample of his intellectual versatility. At the time of his death, Poggioli was working on a number of monographs, some of which were completed by colleagues and friends. In 1965, Harry Levin edited The Spirit of the Letter, a collection of essays that offer a glimpse of Poggioli's wide intellectual acumen and vast knowledge of the literary canon. Among the most ambitious and influential posthumous work, though, is The Autumn Flute, a collection of essays that explores the pastoral theme, defined by the author as an idyllic ideal in a modern bucolic tradition, from the Renaissance to pre-Romanticism. At the avant-garde, the pastoral is presented not just as a literary genre, but rather as a psychological tendency towards escapism. Poggioli whose gaze widens to embrace the whole of Western literature, seeks to grasp the complexity of this theme through the ages, national traditions, and different theoretical approaches. In all these works, Poggioli pursues a thematic approach, exploring the great ideas of Western thought and culture, such as decadence, utopia, avant-garde, pastoral, and tragedy. This theoretical approach corresponds to a new way of understanding literature with respect to his intellectual apprenticeship. There is also a strong continuity between Poggioli's beginnings in Italy and his American years. The themes I just mentioned are the same themes that have oriented his research in the field of Russian poetry ever since the 1930s. They are the same subjects of the course History at Harvard. They are the same areas of interest of the years of maturity, of the translations from Russian and English, and of his posthumous writings. Understanding the intellectual origins of the young Poggioli is therefore fundamental to identify this common thread that brings together all the seasons of his scholarly life. The central role of the young Poggioli was that of mediator between two civilizations, Russian and Italian. But this impetus also persisted in the American years, with wider connotations and ambition. The obsession with the theme of decadence, for example, can be understood as a political reflection on the future of Western civilization, laying the foundations for a project that is not only literary, but also social and political, to be realized through literature. Poggioli's intellectual legacy still resonates in American academia. Many initiatives have attempted to revive Poggioli's legacy in recent years, including a symposium in celebration of his centennial in 2007. Several scholars shortly after Poggioli's death explored his legacy, among them Dante della Terza, Henry Levin, and René Velleck. More recently, Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Giuseppe Mazzotta have referenced Poggioli's work and acknowledged their intellectual depth towards his research. However timid and sputtering, the American efforts to revive critical attention towards Poggioli's work are slowly paying off. Nonetheless, Poggioli is still being snubbed in Italy. What are the reasons for Poggioli's oblivion? Different interpretations have been offered. Della Terza first argued that Italian intellectuals were eager to exclude Poggioli for they felt betrayed by his intellectual flight and could not accept his commentary from abroad. But few of others have investigated this issue. More recently, Mauro Pirani scrutinized an epistolary diatribe between Renato Poggioli and Cesare Pavese that I will summarize briefly. After the publication of the Fiore del Verso Russo in 1949, many members of Einaudi protested against Poggioli's vivid comments on the dire situation of Soviet poets. Out of caution, and in order to prevent the whole editorial board from resigning en masse, Pavese cancelled the scheduled publication of the Theory di Avant-Garde, which was later published by Milano. Pavese sought to explain candidly Einaudi's decision. The Italian Communist Party directly contributed economically to the publisher and did not welcome an author who expressed opinions openly averse to the Soviet Union. Pirani is clear in pointing his finger against Italian communist intellectuals and accuses the Italian Communist Party for opposing Poggioli's unfriendly political views. However, Poggioli himself had reflected on this episode and concluded that probably it was Pavese's excess of caution that prevented his publication. In fact, he continued to work for Einaudi as a talent scout even in the following years. The situation is probably more complicated than the one described by either Pirani and Della Terza. Poggioli always conceived of literature and politics as two sides of the same coin, and the highly polarized political climate of 1950s Italy, there was no room for a work that sought to surpass political partisanship. In the same letter, Poggioli told Pavese that he never identified with either the black, meaning the Democratic Christian Party, or red, meaning the Communist Party, political factions. Pavese clearly responded that such a position was unacceptable in Italy without looking ridiculous or spineless. And it is only ironic that in the United States, because of its expertise in Slavic matters, Poggioli was seen suspiciously during the witch-hunt season of Marxism. Ultimately, Poggioli's new gaze, ahead of its time, removed from this provincial partisanship, was never fully understood. This tragic misunderstanding, unfortunately, was fateful. In conclusion, one cannot deny that Renato Poggioli was an exile of culture. He was uprooted from his country of origin and transplanted to a new one. Exile was a devastating blow for his cultural identity. However, this uprooting shaped his vision, and his decision to stay in the United States was completely voluntary. Poggioli's true exile began after his death, when his lifetime of work failed to be recognized in spite of his effort to reach out to Italy's world of culture. But what can be done to restore Poggioli's legacy to where it belongs? It is often said that Poggioli had two careers, one Italian, one American. I believe that a proper study of Poggioli's work should begin with an accurate analysis of his editorial work on Inventatio, and an attempt to rethink of his Poggioli's career as one sole intellectual trajectory. This is the only way to restore his legacy and international intellectual utopia that Poggioli sought to create with his work. Thank you.
I thank our four speakers for the interesting things that they say, and also for the patience they put in their speeches. And I apologize for the other four speakers. Have some problem. And I don't know if you have some question. It's late, but I think we have the room for some question to our speakers. So if you want.
A brief question for any one of you and a comment. The question to any of you is if you could address a little bit the personal relationship between Paolo Milano and Renato Poggioli, if you have evidence and if you know something about it. And the comment is just regarding this paradox in Paolo Milano's life, that he wanted to be a novelist and he didn't really become one. And I just wanted to comment that, in fact, his diary, the abridged version of the diary that was published, to my mind, has just exquisite and enormous literary qualities to it. And that the level of the sophistication of his intellectual insight, the style, the Italian prose are just extraordinary. And just to add just a very minor personal thing, I grew up in the 70s in Italy, and I read regularly his columns. And again, as an Americanista from Espresso, the quality of his writing about cover books was amazing. I remember more than once getting so excited about the books that he described that I would buy the books only to find that his paraphrasing the authors was better than the author himself. So, and I just
I start with, of course, with sort of a couple of comments about what you said about Paolo Milano. The literary quality of his writing. His writing is really amazing, and it shows that what we now call non-fiction is not less a product of invention, literary imagination than fiction. Because I think that the note in margin in the book we've been talking today is also work out other stories that are maybe less successful from a strict literary point of view. But what does this book so that makes it so outstanding? It's really honest, and is really trying to figure out his own position as exile, not just as a way to talk about his own biography. In a way, this book is a sort of diary of a soul, but it's also a testimony to his own generation, as he said. And he always uses his own position, not just as a point of view on his own condition, but as a broader perspective to understand where American culture, where Italian culture are going. And where also literature is going, because literature is not felt as something static, as something as a sort of artistic product that is divided from history, from life, from existence. It's always not just a product of a man or of a woman, but also is something that can highly criticize what is already there and maybe project what is not there yet to the future of the readers. I love thinking about literature very often as not just as a bridge to other cultures, but also a way to invent other possibilities of being. There is a literary critic, a French literary critic called Jacques Rancière, who's talking about the literature as the art, which is able to individualize also new subjects, new political subjects, meaning once there are some characters that are
that they read about their stories, maybe this character can represent something for a new political discourse. We can recognize ourselves as different, as from a different perspective. And I really feel that with his own, even with his own literary ambition that was always frustrated, in the entire book he writes why I'm not able to become a novelist, as my great friend So Bello, but countless of other friends were always referring as him, as Andrew said before, as our coach. And he was always in these very intimate situations of American writers, even in these retreats in Yaddo. So it was part of the landscape for the intellectual New York of the 40s and the 50s. But still, he represented something that it was, in a way, outstanding from this perspective. I'm also interested in how then he decided to go back to Italy. This is something that maybe historians should work out. I just try to work on the specific book. But I have a feeling that unlike many other Italian intellectuals who are always seeing themselves as provincial in the broader world, he also understood how typical is, how important is the marginal point of view. And his point of view was a marginal point of view because it was the point of view of exile. And I have to say that even within his own reviews for the Espresso, I didn't read them all because there are really thousands, but he was able to capture the marginal perspective that was able to illuminate the work. And that I think is really an artistic endeavor.
As far as the question about the relationship between the two of them, I think I told Sylvia before the meeting that I discovered the power of Google, which may not be the same as going to the archives, but it's actually incredible. If you make the correct search, you can find many things you wouldn't believe. For instance, I knew my father had gone to Hollywood. I knew nothing about what happened. So I decided, well, what the heck, I'll do Hollywood and Paolo Milano. And what happens is that anybody who's ever written in any book about that, it'll come up. You'd never have gone to some book about the cinema, Italian cinema in the 1940s. But what happened was he went to Hollywood to dub, and he got involved in a controversy with the Italian fascist government that wanted, as you said, they wanted people to say lei and be very formal. And he wanted to create an Italian language that could reflect the way an American Hollywood movie was. Now, my point is that by doing that and getting Poggioli and Paolo Milano, I found a kind of a touching letter written by Poggioli to Paolo 2 or 3 years later, after this whole Pavese thing happened, outlining Poggioli's viewpoint on the matter. And there's something in there that tells me they had a relationship. It's not just Caro Paolo, it's not just in La Braccia, but there's something in the whole thing, the way he's trying to present his case that I found touching. So I have a copy of it for Sylvia.
So thank you.